Welcome to In It to Win It. This is Steve Barton, and thank you for tuning in. This time we are talking about good debt versus bad debt. What's the difference? I've always thought that good debt sounds like an oxymoron. How can you possibly have debt that's good? But it does exist, and we'll go over it. Um, I am not a financial advisor. Do not take this as financial advice. This is simply what I'm doing. This is an educational show, and I believe that the number one thing that you can invest in is your own education, especially your financial education. I think that it's all about building wealth and giving back. It's doesn't really do much good to be successful if you don't contribute somehow. And I want to see you guys prosper from the coming wealth transfer instead of being a victim of it. Okay, good debt versus bad debt. What's the difference? Um, I'm going to tell a little story, and I think this will illustrate it. I had a good Thanksgiving with my family. We had Thanksgiving, and then myself, my dad, my brother, and my sister-in-law were watching the news afterwards, and a story came up about inflation. And I thought that was pretty cool. I've been screaming about inflation for the last year, and now it's finally starting to get reported on the mainstream news. They're not saying a damn thing of what to do about it, right? They're just saying that it exists. Well, no duh, but at least it's making the mainstream. So I thought that was kind of cool. But my brother, after the story was over, he said something to the effect, kind of almost under his breath. He said, "The poor and the middle class are going to get slaughtered by this inflation." And that started a discussion. That spurred a discussion between the four of us. And I asked him to elaborate on that. And what he said was he said that most Americans, and probably a lot of people around the world, have a lot of bad debt. In other words, a lot of people have student loans. A lot of people have car payments. A lot of people have credit card debt. And those are types of debt that charge you interest every month that you're not making any money on. And it's eating up a large portion of their monthly bills. And so his argument was that by when you add in the student loan and the credit card and the car payment, there's a lot less income left over, a lot less money left over at the end of the month to pay for things like groceries and gasoline and natural gas to heat your house, right? So as those get inflated, it becomes more and more of a portion of their income and or a portion of their bills. It's going to be more and more difficult for them to pay. Whereas on the other side of the coin, someone that doesn't have any debt, you don't have to worry about that. Does that make sense? So it's an interesting point of view and one that I hadn't really thought of, and he articulated it pretty well. Okay, so what are some examples of bad debt? Well, I've mentioned three, and I'm going to go over them here. I'm going to share my screen. And if you guys are listening on a podcast, you can click on the link in the show notes. It'll take you straight over to YouTube, and you can visually see what it is that I'm talking about. All right, so this is straight from the Federal Reserve's website. You can see it says federal debt, total public debt. Okay, so don't get deceived by the federal part here. The Federal Reserve is not actually part of the federal government. It's a very clever name that would imply that they are, but this is by private shareholders. That's our bank. Okay, so total public debt. All right, we can see over here on the left-hand side, this is in millions of dollars, and then you see 28 million here. Well, since this denomination is in millions, we have to add 6 zeros to that. So, total public debt as of now is 28.5 trillion. That's what we owe. And the way that we're going to pay that down is through inflation and through taxes. All right, so there's one form of debt that you and I can't do anything about. These next three are things that we can do something about, that we have control over. right? Next one here is student loans. Okay. Student loans since the time of 2006 and all the way up here is 7 point, what is that? 7.5, wow. $1.75 trillion is what we owe in student loan debts. If you do not have student loans, good for you. But if you do have student loans, this is your ballpark here. I think that this is one of the worst types of debt that you can have. The reason is because you're getting charged radical interest rates. And on top of that, you cannot get out of this. Even if you claim bankruptcy, you're not off the hook. Okay. You're like, well, what about student loan forgiveness? Okay, well, that hasn't passed yet. And if that's what you're banking on, uh, I think you may want to reevaluate your plan. What are they going to do? Are they going to just roll it over into public debt and then it's on everyone? I don't know, but I know that this is not good debt to have. Next one, credit cards. Here's what we have as a nation as far as credit card debt. This goes back to this graph from the Federal Reserve goes back to 1984. And here's where we are today. Oh, they just came out with quarter three. Okay, so I looked at this the other day, and it was at 791 billion in credit card debt that Americans have, and now we're up to 805 billion in credit card debt. Okay, bad debt to have. They charge radical interest rates if you're ever late on a payment. You know what the what those fees look like. Here's another one. This is car loans. Okay, so motor vehicles and parts long-term debt due more than 1 year. Okay, loans from banks. As a nation, we're sitting at 30 billion in cars that we're driving around that we don't actually own. Okay. All right, so those are some examples of bad debt. All right, now what could we possibly have? Okay, let me give you kind of a plan here instead of I'm looking down at my notes. Um, Credit cards. I do have 2 credit cards, and you say, Steve, that's bad debt. Why would you possibly have credit cards? Well, I pay them off at the end of every month. Okay, I don't run a balance on them. Okay, if you're late on the payment or you run a balance on this, in other words, you don't pay the thing off in full at the end of the month, then it becomes very bad because now you're getting charged radical interest rates, you're getting charged all kinds of fees, and it's stupid. So why do I have these cards? Well, one card gives me 2% cash back on everything that I use to purchase with it. So anything that I can use to purchase with my credit card where the business does not charge me a fee to use that credit card, then I use it, right? Because at the end of the month, when I pay it off, I get 2% of that back. For every $100, I get $2. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you add it up at the end of the year, it comes out to quite a bit. Another card that I have, it gives me 3% off of any gasoline that I buy and groceries. Okay, that can add up, but you have to have the discipline of paying it off at the end of every month. Does that make sense? Okay. For example, when I bought my truck, I drove down to the dealership already knowing which truck I was going to get. It was exactly what I wanted. I called up my credit card company about a week or so before and had them increase the credit limit to, I could put the truck on the credit card knowing that I'm going to get 2% cash back. When I went down there and tried to do that, they said, "No, Mr. Barton, you cannot put this truck on your credit card because we have to pay that 2%. That's where that cash back comes from. Actually, is the seller, the merchant, has to pay that 2%. So that's where I'm getting that 2% from. Not a great deal for the merchant, but a great deal for the buyer. right? Um, so they allowed me to put $5,000 onto that, which I was kind of disappointed because that was only $100, and I was picturing that I was going to get a much bigger discount than that. So I put the $5,000 on there, and I had to pay the rest in cash. So first world problems. But so that's why I have credit cards. If you do not have that discipline, then completely disregard this. Pay off your credit card bills and cut up your credit cards, like Dave Ramsey said. So how do you get out of debt? Let's say this is your wheelhouse. Let's say you have student loans. Let's say you have credit card debt. Let's say you have a car payment. The best blueprint that I've found for this is Dave Ramsey. He's got a book called Total Money Makeover. I know he's got a podcast. I kind of like his blueprint in there for the average person. One, he calls it his snowball effect. So essentially, let's say that we have these three debts: student loans, credit cards, and car payment. Take whichever one has the smallest balance on it. We'll say it's your car payment. Pay that one off first, and whatever extra money you were putting into that car payment is now gone, and you now own the car. And then you roll that extra money over into the next one. We'll say it's a credit card. Now, once you pay off the credit card, you roll that extra money, the extra money that you had for the car payment, the extra money that you had for the credit card payment, and you roll it into your student loan. So it's like a snowball rolling down the hill. As it rolls down the hill, it picks up snow or it picks up money and gets dumped into the following one. I don't agree with everything that Dave Ramsey says. He says not to own credit cards. He never even talks about the benefits of, like the example I just gave about I've got a couple of credit cards, and I get a few percent cash back from it every year. He just assumes that everyone doesn't have that discipline to do that, and I don't think that that's the case. I think that's the case for the majority of people, but it's at least worth talking about. Another thing that I don't agree with him on is he's not a fan of precious metals. He says they don't pay a dividend. He says that they're not inversely related to economic uncertainty, and he's right in the sense that there is no guarantee that the prices of precious metals will go up during times of economic uncertainty. But when you look back over history, over hundreds and hundreds of years, that has been the case. So if if history repeats itself, then I think it's extremely likely that that will be the case. It doesn't have to be, but I think it will. Okay, so just a little caveat in there. Okay, so we've talked about bad debt. Now, what is good debt? Good debt would be taking on debt for something that is going to cash flow and pay you every month. Okay, how do we do that? Right now, interest rates are lower than they have been in 5,000 years. Okay, so since the invention of money, it has never ever been cheaper to borrow money. Okay, you can get a fixed rate interest, fixed interest rate on a mortgage right now for anywhere from 3.2 to 3.5%. It was more expensive for the Egyptians to borrow money than it is for us today, and it has never been cheaper. Okay, now when inflation is higher than that, then you're winning. And if you can put that into an income producing property, that would be good debt. Let me show you some examples. We're going to first go into what inflation is so that you can see that actually can be profitable. All right, so we're going to go here. Okay, this is the Federal Reserve website again, and this is their CPI. We'll blow this screen up a little bit for you so we can make it bigger. Okay, Consumer Price Index. This is another little acronym for inflation. All right, this goes back to 1960 and all the way up until today. What they are reporting as inflation is, you can see the blue dot at the end there, 6.24%. Okay, so that means that things now in this consumer price index, in what they're calculating inflation at, they're saying that goods and services now cost 6.24% more than they did in October of last year, in October of 2020. Now, there's two lines here. You see the blue line and you see the red line. I don't really know why they do the red line, because the blue line is consumer price index for all urban consumers, all items, right? Then the red line is consumer price index for all urban consumers minus food and energy. So maybe the red line is for people that don't need electricity and food, and the blue line is for people that do. I don't know. I'm not sure why they do that. But anyhow, let's pay attention to the blue line. So what the government is reporting as inflation, 6.2%, is less than 3.5. That makes 3.5% on the fixed rate that you can get to borrow money. Does that make sense? So right there, you're gaining. Here's another, this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, Consumer Price Index Summary. And we can go down here, all items, 6.2% right here, year over year, adjusted for 12 months, okay? We can see that food is 5.3. This is what they're reporting. Energy is 30%, energy commodities, 49, gasoline, 49%, fuel oil 59%, gas for your stove, natural gas 28%, used cars and trucks 26%, right? So that is far north of 3.5%, the cost to borrow money, right? Okay. This is shadowstats.com. This is John Williams' site, and he calculates inflation as well. Now, what he does that's interesting is that he calculates the basket of goods, the formula that they used back in the 1980s and before, and the 1990s, right? So what happened here back in the 1980s, if we go up here in 1980, see how high inflation got? I mean, it got up to 14.5%. Well, what they started doing was they started changing the basket of goods that they used to calculate this, because it got so high and people were getting kind of mad. All right. Instead of having an average mortgage payment in there, an average mortgage, they started switching it to, they called it owner occupied rent, which they basically asked the homeowner what would he rent his house to himself for, whatever the hell that means. And of course, rent is going to be less than a mortgage most of the time. And that allowed him to knock off 1.5% there. They started changing, instead of a T-bone steak, they threw in ground beef, and that made inflation appear much lower than it actually was, right? They did the same thing in 1990 again. They said, okay, we can't adjust this again for another 10 years, which they did on the dot in 1990. And now we're adjusting it about every 2 years. This is decided by Congress. If you're curious about that, you can go back and listen to my episode with John Williams, where he describes this. My point is, if you go onto John Williams' website, where he uses the basket of goods that they used back in 1980 and 1990, you can see right here in 1990, inflation is just south of 10% using that basket of goods. And if you use the 1981, which they used for decades before that, inflation is just south of 15%. When I had him on my show, he said it was 13.5. It looks like it's getting right there around 14. That that's what it would be if we were to use that basket of goods that they used in 1980. Now, how do you really calculate that? There's been a lot of things that have come into existence in the last 41 years that didn't used to exist before, things like cell phones, laptops. How do you calculate that in? My personal opinion is that it's probably somewhere in between. It's going to be different for every family because some people drive a lot more, so gasoline's going to hit them harder. It all depends on your situation. My point is, if you can borrow money at 3.5% and inflation is somewhere between 6.2 and 13.5, you're winning, right? Okay. Now I'm going to go into a little example here. I just wrote up an arbitrary example of how you can use good debt to make money. Okay, well, say we have a rental property that we're looking at a house. The going rent in the area is $1,200 per month, and so that's your income column. I probably should have written income there, and then you have your expenses. So this is how you figure out, if you're going to cash flow on a property or not. Figure out what the mortgage is. I just wrote $500, taxes 100, insurance, maintenance. Okay, these first four you're going to have. You're going to have a mortgage. You're going to have to pay taxes. You're going to have insurance in case the house burns down. And you're going to have to do maintenance on the property. There is no property that doesn't require maintenance, right? Other expenses that you could have or you may not are property management. If you manage it yourself, you can save that. Although it is kind of a headache, I prefer just to have property management because I don't want to deal with it. You could have a PMI. This is basically, generally speaking, if you don't put 20% down on a property, you have to pay the bank insurance on yourself that you're not going to default on the loan. I think it's just a way for them to make extra money. But anyhow, you may have that as an expense. Hopefully you don't buy a rental income in an HOA property because those things, those payments never go down. They always go up. But if you do, you have to factor that in. Now, if we add up all these numbers under this arbitrary example, we get $1,000 per month. So if the rent is 200, our expenses are 1,000. You take 1,200 minus 1,000, and you get a cash flow of $200 per month. So this would be an example of how you can borrow money, you can take on debt, and it's good debt because it's paying you every month. Okay. There is some things just to be aware of that, and I might kind of be going into the weeds here, but you got to take into account occupancy rates. Okay. How often is someone actually renting your property? You got to take into account turnover rates. So how often occupancy rates, turnover rates, how often is your property rented? How often do people move out? It's very expensive. I can tell you as a landlord, it's very expensive when someone moves out, right? So in this example, okay, we're making $200 a month. If someone moves out, you lose that month of rent. You don't get that $1,200, but you still have to pay $1,000. The mortgage company doesn't care if anyone's in there or not. They want their money, and so does everyone else here, right? So just by someone moving out, your loss in income is $1,000 for that month. So it's going to take you 5 months to make that up, right? And when people move out, you got to do carpet and paint and cleaning and advertising to get someone else in there. And hopefully it's only a month that you're out of rent, but it could be longer. So that is something to be aware of. But look at what you could do. If you didn't have an HOA, then that's an extra $180 a month. That's almost double your cash flow, right? Yeah. So this is an example of how you can have good debt. You can have cash flow on a debt that you take on, right? And they're paying you every month, even though it's debt. right? So we don't want student loans. We don't want car payments. We don't want credit card debt. Some people even finance furniture. That I think is an inherently bad bet. But there is such a thing as good debt, and this is an example of it. Hope you got something out of this. Like and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time.